Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. Welcome to the OECD, to our speaker series on empowering public understanding. My name's Andrew Blasey, and I'm the Deputy Head of Public Management and Budgeting at the OECD. Today, I'll be your moderator for this event, which is being recorded. This speaker series is built around a simple but urgent idea that good fiscal policy tools alone are no longer enough. If we want to tackle the long-term fiscal and structural challenges that our countries face, we need more than technical fixes to go about this. We need public legitimacy. That means empowering citizens to understand the trade-offs, the risks, the consequences of action and inaction. Crucially, this relies on a trusted information environment where facts can be communicated effectively. It's fitting that our speaker today is Nic Newman, Senior Research Fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University. Nic is the lead author of the annual Digital News Report, the world's largest ongoing study of consumer behavior around news. He brings a deep historical and practical context to this subject. Before the Reuters Institute, Nic spent 20 years at the BBC, where he was a founding member of the BBC News website in 1997. He led international news coverage for 5 years, before then heading technology and product development for the BBC. Today, his work focuses on the intersection of media, technology, and audience behavior. He's published standalone research on the changing nature of social media, the rise of news creators, and the fragility of trust. Shortly, Nic will share his insights into these media trends and how they impact on the public's ability to engage with complex issues, in particular those that are relevant to public finance. He'll speak for around 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to welcome questions and comments from all of you. So thank you for being here with us today. Nic, we're honoured to have you join us, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Good afternoon, everybody. Really good to be here. So I'm going to talk about some of the changes that we have seen in our data in terms of the news environment and how audiences are consuming the news, attitudes to the news, and some of the implications for news organizations and policymakers. So I'm going to use data from our digital news report to look at some of the changes that we've seen over time. And they've really been very, very fundamental over the last 10 years. We'll look at trust, misinformation, and then at some of the current changes that are going on in the media space, particularly in terms of platforms, because that's really going to shape the next 5 years. So a little bit about what's next. So I'm mainly going to set out the landscape and the implications for budgetary policymakers, and media organizations. We can pick up in Q&A. They'll try and bear that in mind as we go along. So if you're not aware of the Digital News Report, it's the largest ongoing global study of news consumption. We started in 2012. It now covers 48 different markets, so a huge survey, around 100,000 each year. You can see the countries represented there. We've tried to make it more global over time. All the limitations of public surveys. But I think they are also a really good way of capturing actually this very fragmented environment that's very hard to capture through industry data alone. Polling was done on our behalf by YouGov partners, and we have many sponsors. Our main sponsor is the Google News Initiative, but we have broadcasters like the BBC, NHK in Japan. We have academic institutions. We have regulators as well. So one of the advantages of these kind of surveys, we can ask exactly the same question every year, and you can really see the structural changes to the media environment over time. And I'm just going to start with the US because that's where we've, it's a country we all know well. We've seen a lot of change, and then I'll come back to other countries afterwards. So this chart really just shows the decline in attention, weekly reach, essentially, for traditional media. So you can see television news in the US down from 7 in 10 watching it on a weekly basis to just 5 in 10. Online news sites are down. Maybe that's more of a surprise. Print, we know, is going down. So some of the most traditional media sources getting a lot less attention. At the same time, over that decade, we've seen this increase in social and video networks. and a particular increase in the last year. So for the first time in the US, we see social video networks as a news source overtaking traditional television news in the US. What's interesting is if you go back to 2016, so the first Trump election victory, you can see that all of these media sources benefited. This time round, it was basically just the social and video networks. At the same time, we've seen the rise of news podcasts in the US, actually overtaking news radio in our data. And we've seen the start of AI news emerging, and 7% said they accessed some kind of chatbot news in the last week. I'll talk more about that as we go along. So if we just look at a couple of other countries, you see very similar trends. So here's France, 84% down. In France, television's been incredibly popular, really key way in which news is being communicated. And you can see that is down very significantly. You can see online news sites down significantly, print's down significantly. One of the differences is that social media is not as important in many Northern European countries. Um, and so you can see it plays a slightly lower role, but again, you see that little uptick, which is really related to the creator economy, which I'll come back to later. And then again, the rise of news podcasts and news starting to emerge through AI as well. So very similar trends. If we look in many global majority countries, we see a very different pattern. And this is worth bearing in mind because we talk a lot about the US and Northern Europe, but actually in many parts of the world, already the main way in which people are accessing news content is through social and video networks. This is Malaysia as an example. And again, you can see the decline in online news sites and television news in print. I should say that in Malaysia, our sample is a little bit more urban based, and there are a lot of people not online who still rely on television and broadcast. So it is still important more generally. But these are trends that are going to become more important. Those averages, if you look at the age groups, this is really interesting. The sort of age split in terms of what people's preferences are. Where do what would you say is your main source of news? You can see older people basically still clinging on to the media they grew up with, still very familiar with television. They've grafted on digital habits, but basically television still matters. But you can see younger groups are really digital, and not just digital, but many of them are social first. So that split is really the driving force, and the generational differences are really the driving force of these changes. And you can see that 44% across all markets of 18-24 say that social media is their main source of news now, which means that and for all of those groups, all of the younger groups, actually anybody under 45, they're more likely to say they're going to go to social media than directly to a news website and app. And that's what's driving some of that loss of people going directly to news websites and apps. At the same time, you also see younger people much more likely to access news podcasts, much more likely to access AI chatbots. This is, of course, very emerging behavior, but I still think that's going to become much more important over time. One change over the last decade that is really important for some of the issues we're discussing today, but is often, I think, overlooked, is the change of device. So a decade ago, people were broadly accessing via a computer or a laptop primarily, and the smartphone, although it had been around for a while, was still kind of secondary. And you can see how that tipped around 2017 in the UK, and increasingly this sort of powerful device in your pocket is the main way in which people access news. And that's really important because it means that the formats are changing. Text as a way of communicating long articles really don't work on a smartphone. So this is really pushing a lot of the change of the formats that we see towards vertical video, towards short form video, towards platforms like TikTok, as well as towards podcasts, because they sort of really fit with the smartphone, all of this audio content and what goes into your ears at the same time. So it's often forgotten. The other point about the smartphone is it's really disrupted the business models. So adjacent display advertising worked very well on print. It worked pretty badly on desktop, and it hardly works at all on the smartphone. So that's another factor which has really undermined the business models, which undermines the sort of independence and the resources that can go into independent journalism. So really important. And actually, this is a really interesting chart from the US where we're basically looking at where people say they get their news first in the morning. And you can see again over a decade, you can see how television has lost its place. Essentially, smartphone has taken that time, has stolen that time. And we've gone from this sort of shared experience, Americans sitting down watching Good Morning America, whatever, or discussing the evening news together in a sort of rational way, into these sort of independent, fragmented personal choices where you are consuming news largely on your own or with online communities. And I think, again, that sort of fed into some of the increased polarization that we're seeing around news. Um, so what does this add up to? This is a picture taken on a London Underground probably about a year ago, and not a year, 10 years ago. And what you're based two things about this. One is people are reading the same thing, so common facts, and also this sense of a time for briefing yourself on the day. We have these habits, right? And that's really shifted. So what does that look like today? It looks more like that. So we don't know exactly what these people are doing. I often look over people's shoulders when I'm on the underground just to check, but it's last night's television, it's games, it's podcast. Again, this fragmentation, and a lot of it is not news. So news is really competing. There's always something more interesting to do wherever you are now, because you have access to so much entertainment and other content. So the upshot is it's getting harder to attract the attention in the first place, and it's getting harder to keep it. So that brings me on to some of the things we're seeing in the data, which is that people, as a result of all that, are paying less attention than they used to really important subjects like budgets. And this chart shows the percentage of people who say that they are interested or very interested in news in a range of countries. And you can see that a decade ago, around 70% said that they were very interested or interested in news. And that has crashed to 39% in the UK, similar declines in many other countries. You can see that particularly after COVID. COVID seemed to be a real tipping point in terms of people's attention for certain serious types of topics. I think part of this is also about the changing definitions of news since COVID. So there's much sort of extended definitions. And I think what we're seeing here is really people talking about politics and sort of traditional notions of news. But it's not happening everywhere. And we'll come back to this later. But I think, there are definitely countries where we have stronger trust, stronger attention to important subjects, the culture of news in countries like Finland, for example, whereas some of that seems to have been lost in other major industrialized countries. Related to that, we've been asking a question about news avoidance. To what extent do you avoid the news, actively avoid the news? And this, in one sense, this is a shocking figure. 40% of our entire sample across 46, 48 countries say that they sometimes or often avoid the news, and that's up from 29% in 2017. This is not that people are avoiding it all the time or completely. There are a few people like that, but most people are essentially turning away from it at particular times or to protect their mental health. People say things like the news is constantly negative, it brings my mood down, it makes me depressed. They say it causes arguments that I'd rather avoid. So a lot of that is to do with sort of polarizing debates, increased negativity. Some people say, particularly younger people say, it's because the news is too hard to follow and understand. I think that's a really interesting one to sort of follow through. And of course, the news agenda is pretty depressing, but also the way that it is covered by the news industry is also not necessarily helping here. Do people feel overloaded? This is a part of it. Another question we ask is, to what extent do you feel overloaded? This is just UK data, but you can see 2019, 26% said they felt overloaded by the amount of news, and 2024, 41%. So that number has almost doubled. We used to have a couple of outlets. Now it's constant, sensationalized news from multiple sources. We're bombarded with information, alerts. It is overwhelming. I've had to stop it and turn it off. And I think what's happened is news, to get the attention in the attention economy, news publishers are just producing more of everything, more podcasts, more news articles, more news alerts. And it's absolutely the opposite of what most people want. People want more signal and less noise. And what they're getting is more noise. And a lot of that, of course, is to do with the way platforms are essentially the incentives that platforms have to produce more and more content rather than necessarily more meaningful content. So what are publishers doing about this? So there's some really interesting initiatives. I think this is probably relevant to policymakers as well. So one of the things that they're doing is sort of trying to broaden away from pure politics. So a number of them are sort of setting up these sort of verticals around happiness, fitness, health. So other things to make the news more varied, I guess. Other initiatives are around, taking subjects, important subjects like budgets or politics, and treat it differently. So solutions-based journalism, constructive journalism is another movement that's particularly strong in Northern Europe. So instead of just sort of looking for the bad and everything, you actually look at issues where something has worked really well in one country and lessons you can pass on to another country. This is particularly public service broadcasters have done a lot of this, and are trying to build more of these techniques into what they do. Um, Emphasizing empathy, making news more accessible. I think this goes back to the difficulty that many young people find in following the news when it's also fragmented in social media feeds. So can you do more news explainers about important subjects? So that's been a real trend since COVID with media companies and others. And this is just an interesting example from a Swedish publisher who launched a new app aimed at younger people, but also for older people. So read less, know more. So this idea of trying to find the signal from the noise, but also using more accessible formats, more visual formats. Moving on to trust and misinformation. So there is a sort of narrative that, trust has never been worse and it's constantly declining. We don't actually find that, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years. In most countries, the declines in trust have stabilized, but it's still not a pretty picture. So if you look at the United Kingdom, for example, used to be, high trust country, 51%, so they trusted most news most of the time. And that's down to 35%. And what's interesting about that, and you can see that decline around the time of Brexit and after Brexit, and then some recovery with COVID. And I think what that really is telling us, and we know this from talking to people about why they say they distrust the news, a lot of this is about increased polarization in society. It's not that the journalism has got worse necessarily, but it's that people see things in the media that they strongly disagree with in these sort of polarized times. It could be Brexit, it could be gender politics, it could be any of the topics of the culture wars, and combined with sort of increased criticism of the media in social media and from other media companies, this has led to some of these sort of perception changes that you see there. I'm not saying there aren't real issues as well. In France, we've seen, a lot of sort of the sense that the media is sort of part of the elites. They're not really representing ordinary people. So that's a factor in France, for example, but you see similar significant declines. But again, it's not happening everywhere. So there are many other countries with higher trust in institutions, higher trust in media, Nordic countries in particular, where we haven't seen declines at all. And then in misinformation, this is a tracking question we've asked for a number of years. To what extent are you worried about what's true and false on the internet? And we've seen those numbers broadly rise. So on average, 58%. So they're worried about that. Much higher in some countries where social media is used a lot more, where media brands are trusted less, and there's a weaker connection between them. So I think there's a clear sort of connection there. And of course, coming down the tracks, we have, another issue which people are really worried about when you talk to them, particularly younger people who are exposed to a lot more of these sort of AI-generated fakes and AI slop, which is filling people's social media feeds at the moment. It used to be that you were pretty skeptical of text. You could always see the biases or were looking for biases in text, but people at least trusted the images. They trusted what they could see with their eyes and the videos. And going forwards, that's not going to be the case. So I think that's going to raise, a whole load of questions, potentially also some opportunities for trusted brands to show that they're different. So that brings me on to, so in many ways, that's really just a sort of look at some of the things we've seen in terms of longitudinal data around trust, around consumption. But I think we're really at the beginning of another stage where the platforms in particular are changing in terms of what kind of content they promote. And that's, of course, going to have an impact on what formats are going to work and how audiences get news and what news they see in what formats. So this chart shows some of the changes we've seen over the last decade around how people access news through some of those social and video networks. There's two things going on here. If you look back a decade, you can see it was primarily around Facebook, a bit of YouTube and a bit of X, but basically Facebook was really, really dominant. And where we are now is just a much, much more fragmented social and video space. So video networks more important. You can see that. That's really where we're seeing the growth. So YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. Facebook's become less important over time, but we're also seeing closed messaging applications, WhatsApp, Discord, a whole range of other ways in which people are communicating, often in combination. But the model has changed. So instead of publishers or anybody who wants to communicate with the public putting out some hooks into social media and then getting some links back to a website, that's not the model anymore because those platforms are increasingly pushing formats like video where you stay in the platform. They do not want people to come away from the platform. And so that means you have to create completely different bespoke content for these platforms if you're going to engage with the audiences that you're trying to reach. So it's a completely different model. And that's obviously affecting fundamentally the business models of news organizations as well. And then what we've seen is the referrals from Facebook declined by 67% in 2 years, the referrals in aggregate to news publishers, and from X by 50%. And now people are worried that the same thing's going to happen to search. So in a survey we did of publishers, this is a publisher survey at the beginning of the year, 74% of leading news executives felt that the referrals were going to decrease from search very significantly because of the new AI overviews that appear there and essentially the AI chatbots answering your questions, and you don't need to click on to a news website. So this is like an existential concern that many news organizations have. This is what it looks like. All of your AI chatbots now have the ability to answer really detailed, interesting questions. They aggregate that content. In most cases, they haven't paid for it. And instead of really high profile links, there's just a few citations, and that's generating far fewer links going forwards. That's the fear. Beyond that, we're also, over the next few years, we're going to see AI creating a whole lot of experiences that look much more like the media itself. This was perplexity during the US election. And this sort of live interactive results service was pretty much exactly what the New York Times, the BBC, and others were doing. So pretty much identical, but delivered by machines. In the last few months, we've seen ChatGPT Pulse. There's a service called Hux, and these are all personalized news services, which essentially aggregate a whole load of content and bring you your personalized briefing for the day. We've been promised this for a long time, but this is actually happening now. And then integrated into almost every tool you use are these abilities. It might be WhatsApp, it might be Grok. You can ask any question about the news and it can surface news-like content. So on the one hand, you have AI and the implications of AI. On the other hand, you've got this sort of whole renaissance in sort of personality-led news and the creator economy. And this is partly driven by changes in preference in terms of formats. So one of the questions we ask is to what extent do you prefer to read, watch, or listen to the news? And really interesting differences across countries here. But broadly, people still say they prefer to read the news, 55%, but that blue bit has got bigger. So 31% say they prefer to watch. So video is becoming more important. In some countries like Finland, strong reading tradition, text is still king. In a whole load of other countries, actually, people prefer to watch rather than read. And that has a lot of implications as well about how you get across detailed, complicated messages. Television and video is not necessarily as good as text in or audio in doing a lot of those things. Much of this is happening in the global majority, in the global south, global majority countries. This is where we're seeing a huge proportion of people saying they're accessing news by YouTube. We're seeing similar, smaller numbers for TikTok, but similar growth. So just to compare it, 56% in Thailand say that they're accessing some kind of news through YouTube. Much of that's through creators as well as through traditional media companies. That's moving much more slowly in the UK at 13%. And We've just published a big report, 24 countries, looking at who are some of these individuals, these creators, and what kind of content are they producing and talking about, and how's that affecting our news. And what we find is sort of four different types. So we have political commentators, and in many cases, I've just picked out Tucker Carlson, Russell Brand, Julian Reichelt. They tend to be from the right, they tend to be men, they tend to be partisan, they tend to be much more extreme, more popular based, many of them based in populist narratives. Secondly, you've got sort of a huge rise in infotainment. Many of these are podcasts or vodcasts. Many of them have been used by politicians to access audiences. Alex Cooper, for example, Kamala Harris went on her podcast to reach a younger audience that traditional media is not reaching. Some of these have huge audiences. Stephen Bartlett, biggest uh, podcast in the UK. Rezo, musician in Germany, who did a big viral video condemning political parties in Germany for letting down young people over the environment, and that had a huge influence because of his cachet with young people. You have explanatory journalists like Hugo de Crypt in France. So these are young people essentially remixing and simplifying the news in networks like TikTok and YouTube. And then there's a whole new wave, which is really interesting when it comes to detailed information about budgets, for example, or any other subject, which is sort of substackers, this big growth of people who are real specialists in a particular area. I'm sure you get a lot of news from some of these people, extending and deepening the range of that news, setting up on their own. It's never been easier, better tools, better distribution, and the ability to get paid for it as well. So we're seeing a sort of talent drain from traditional media into some of these areas, which is really interesting. And just finally, there is a political impact to this, because as influencers become partisan influencers become a key way in which people access the news, politicians like Donald Trump, and it's not just Donald Trump, pretty much all politicians are doing this, are leaning into sympathetic influencers as a way of getting their message across rather than be scrutinized by the media. Milei in Argentina is another one who's sort of built his own presence. He's built a network of sympathetic podcasters and creators to help him get his messages across. It's hugely effective. And there's a lot of concern about what this means for trusted evidence-based news if that is another force that's pushing us towards more complicated, more partisan perspectives. So just a quick recap, and then get into questions, which I'm really looking forward to. So attention loss. Some people have never been better informed, but very large sections of society are becoming less interested. Many are actively avoiding it. And of course, that means that, if you're trying to get support for really complicated budgetary issues, that's a real challenge, is how to get beyond the elites. Platform shifts, I think we're at the beginning of this new shift. Some platforms are disinvesting for news, others setting up alternative ways of getting news via AI. Videos on the rise, as I mentioned, influencers and creators also on the rise. That has implications for the type of news and who is delivering the news. And then trust remains low. And many in these polarized times, many are increasingly hostile to traditional brands, and concern about misinformation is rising. I didn't mention business models, but underneath it, of course, is how do we properly fund journalism so it can fulfill its function in democratic societies. I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Nic.